Something feels different about this episode. Not because of a huge dragon battle, not because another major character dies, but because almost every single person in Westeros suddenly seems trapped. Trapped by prophecy, trapped by duty, trapped by family, and in some cases, trapped by the choices they made years ago. House of the Dragons has always been a story about power, but Episode 5 quietly reminds us that power rarely makes people free. In fact, the closer someone gets to the Iron Throne, the less control they actually seem to have. Rhaenyra cannot control her kingdom. Aemond cannot control his fears. Alicent cannot control her children. Aegon cannot control his own fate. And perhaps most importantly, the war itself can no longer be controlled, because for the first time in a long time, it feels like the dance of the dragons is beginning to move on its own, like a fire that has grown too large for anyone to stop. And that makes this episode incredibly important, because while Episode 5 may appear quieter on the surface, it is actually preparing the board for some of the biggest tragedies yet to come. The episode opens with armies moving across the Riverlands, and immediately one thing becomes clear. This war is changing. At the beginning of the conflict, dragons were everything. Every lord feared them. Every castle feared them. Every decision revolved around dragons. But now, people are adapting. Generals are learning. Commanders are becoming smarter, and ordinary men are finding ways to survive in a world ruled by dragons. That shift is terrifying, because dragons are only invincible when people believe they are invincible. Once that fear begins to crack, everything changes. The Hightowers understand this. Their commanders know they cannot defeat dragons through strength alone. So instead, they rely on delay, manipulation, terrain, politics, fear, and that strategy may actually be more dangerous than dragons themselves, because dragons destroy cities, ideas destroy kingdoms, and right now, dangerous ideas are spreading everywhere. People are beginning to question Rhaenyra. People are beginning to question the Targaryens, and perhaps, for the first time, some are beginning to imagine a world where dragons can lose. That is a massive turning point. One of the biggest themes in this episode is perception, not reality. Perception. Because rulers do not simply need power, they need people to believe they deserve power. And Rhaenyra's greatest problem right now is that she is slowly losing that belief. Think about her situation. She has dragons. She has armies. She sits in King's Landing. On paper, she should look unstoppable. Yet almost everyone around her seems worried. Why? Because ruling is very different from conquering. Winning a throne is one thing, keeping it is another. Every day brings new rebellions, new conspiracies, new shortages, new enemies, and slowly the image of the perfect queen begins to crack. This is exactly what Viserys feared. His entire life he tried to hold his family together because he understood something tragic. The Iron Throne consumes people. It turns brothers into enemies, children into weapons, parents into prisoners. And now we're seeing that happen again. Rhaenyra finally has the crown, yet she seems more exhausted than ever. Because becoming queen did not solve her problems, it multiplied them. Another fascinating part of this episode is Daemon. For so long, Daemon wanted power. He wanted respect. He wanted recognition. But now that the kingdom is falling apart around him, he almost seems disappointed, because deep down, Daemon always imagined war as something glorious, a chance for greatness, a chance to prove himself. Instead, what he sees is chaos, fear, starvation, murder, political games, and endless betrayal. The romance of war is disappearing, and reality is replacing it. This is one of the reasons Daemon remains such an interesting character. He's a man who spent his entire life chasing legends, yet every legend eventually turns into tragedy. Even his relationship with Rhaenyra reflects this. There's still affection between them, still loyalty, but there's also frustration, distance,
disappointment, because both of them are changing, and perhaps neither truly understands the person the other has become. Daemon wants strength, action, decisiveness. Rhaenyra wants stability, control, legitimacy. Those two visions are slowly moving apart, and that could become incredibly dangerous later. Because civil wars are often lost not when enemies grow stronger, but when allies begin wanting different futures. Then there's Aemond, and honestly, Episode 5 gives us one of the most fascinating looks into his psychology. Aemond has always tried to appear fearless, cold, almost inhuman. But underneath that image is someone deeply broken, a man carrying years of humiliation, neglect, anger, and loneliness. For most of his life, Aemond was the forgotten child, the younger brother, the one people underestimated, the boy who lost an eye, the boy who had to become stronger because nobody protected him. That kind of pain changes people. Sometimes it creates heroes, sometimes monsters, and sometimes both. The tragedy of Aemond is that he desperately wants control, but he's actually controlled by his emotions more than almost anyone else. His pride controls him, his resentment controls him, his need for validation controls him. Even his ambition is driven by emotional wounds. That's why he's such a dangerous ruler, because wounded people often believe power will heal them. But power doesn't heal old scars. It usually makes them worse. And throughout this episode, we begin seeing cracks in Aemond's armor: fear, confusion, doubt, emotional vulnerability. These are things he tries desperately to hide, yet they continue appearing, because no matter how powerful someone becomes, they cannot escape themselves. There's also something symbolic happening here. Aemond rides the largest dragon in the world. Vhagar is essentially a living weapon, an unstoppable force. Yet Aemond himself feels increasingly isolated, almost powerless. That contrast is brilliant, because dragons in House of the Dragons often reflect the emotional state of their riders. And despite having the mightiest dragon alive, Aemond remains deeply insecure. He still seeks approval, still seeks affection, still seeks understanding. It reminds us that strength and happiness are not the same thing. A person can command armies and still feel alone. A person can conquer kingdoms and still feel empty. And perhaps that emptiness is what makes Aemond so unpredictable, because lonely people often become desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. Meanwhile, another major theme of this episode is motherhood. House of the Dragons repeatedly returns to this idea. What do parents owe their children, and what do children owe their parents? Nearly every major tragedy in this story comes back to family. Viserys loved his children, but failed to unite them. Alicent tried to protect her children, but filled them with fear. Rhaenyra wants to protect her family, but keeps losing pieces of it. Even Aemond and Aegon remain shaped by childhood wounds. Because family in this world is both a source of love and a source of destruction. And that duality makes the story feel painfully human. Nobody here believes they are the villain. Everyone thinks they are protecting someone. Everyone thinks they are doing what is necessary. Yet those same actions continue creating more suffering. That's the tragedy of the dance. It is not a war between good and evil. It's a war between wounded people. People carrying grief, fear, jealousy, love, pride, and those emotions are often more destructive than dragonfire. Another hidden idea in this episode is legacy. Everyone is obsessed with what will remain after they are gone. Kings want songs written about them. Lords want their bloodlines remembered. Warriors want glorious deaths. But House of the Dragon keeps asking a painful question. What if your legacy is suffering? What if history remembers you for destruction instead of greatness? Criston Cole is a perfect example. He still talks about honor, duty, glory, Yet the war he helped create has consumed nearly everything. Thousands are dying, kingdoms are burning, families are being destroyed, and somewhere deep inside, he knows it. That makes him one of the show's most tragic characters, because sometimes people spend years chasing meaning only to realize they helped build a nightmare.
But if episode 5 is about kingdoms falling apart on the outside, it is equally about people falling apart on the inside. Because beneath all the politics, all the dragons, and all the wars, this episode is really asking one painful question. How much of our lives are actually our own? Because almost everyone here seems trapped inside a role they never truly chose. And nowhere is that more obvious than with Alicent Hightower. For years, Alicent believed duty would save her. She sacrificed her youth, her happiness, her friendships, even parts of herself. Everything was done in service of family, honor, and the realm. And what did it give her? A dead kingdom, broken children, and a war she can no longer control. There is something deeply tragic about Alicent because she is finally beginning to realize that almost every sacrifice she made may have been meaningless. Imagine carrying responsibility your entire life, only to wake up one day and realize the world still collapsed anyway. That realization can break people. And in many ways, Alicent already looks broken. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually. There is exhaustion in her now. A quiet sadness, almost as if she already knows there is no true way back, because there isn't. Some choices cannot be undone, some wars cannot be stopped, and some wounds never heal. This also explains why her relationship with Helaena feels so important. Unlike everyone else in this story, Helaena never wanted power. She never wanted crowns, never wanted political games. She simply wanted peace. And that makes her one of the most tragic figures in the entire dance, because gentle people often suffer the most during violent times. Helaena almost feels like someone from another story, a person too kind for this world, too sensitive for this family, too pure for this war. Yet despite her fragile nature, she possesses something many powerful people do not: clarity. She sees things others ignore. She understands things others cannot. There is almost a spiritual quality to her character, as if she exists slightly outside normal reality. Throughout House of the Dragon, Helaena has repeatedly spoken in riddles and visions. Many people around her dismiss these moments, but viewers know better, because her words almost always mean something, which makes every scene involving her incredibly unsettling. Whenever Helaena speaks, it feels like destiny itself is whispering, and that creates a terrifying idea. What if everyone in this story is simply moving toward an ending that cannot be avoided? Prophecy has always been dangerous in the world of Game of Thrones, because once people believe in fate, they often end up creating the very future they fear. Viserys believed in prophecy. Rhaenyra believes in prophecy. Aegon the Conqueror built his dynasty around prophecy. Even Aemond seems haunted by destiny, and perhaps that is the true curse of the Targaryens. Not dragons, not madness, but the belief that they are somehow chosen. Because believing you are chosen can become incredibly dangerous. It can justify terrible decisions. It can convince people ignore reality. It can convince rulers that every sacrifice is necessary. History is full of people who believed destiny was on their side, and many of them left destruction behind. Then there is Aegon, and honestly, Episode 5 continues one of the most fascinating transformations in the series, because for the first time, Aegon is beginning to understand who he really is. Earlier in the story, Aegon avoided responsibility. He hid behind pleasure, behind jokes, behind arrogance. But suffering changes people. Pain strips away illusions, and Aegon has suffered more than almost anyone else. He lost his son, lost his body, lost his crown, lost his sense of identity, and now he is left with only one thing: his anger. Sometimes tragedy creates wisdom, sometimes it creates bitterness. For Aegon, it may be creating both, because beneath all the resentment, there is finally a degree of self-awareness. He is beginning to understand that power did not make him happy. Kingship did not save him. The throne did not complete him. Instead, it destroyed nearly everything around him. That realization feels incredibly human, because many people spend their lives chasing something, only to discover that it was never the answer. At the same time, his hatred towards Aemond continues growing, and honestly, This conflict feels inevitable because these brothers have always represented two different forms of pain. Aegon is the child who had too much freedom. Aemond is the child who had too little love. Aegon wasted his gifts. Aemond was shaped by his wounds, and both secretly envy the other. That's what makes their relationship so tragic. Neither brother truly understands the other. Neither understands the loneliness the other carried. Instead, they only see resentment, failure, betrayal. And because of that, their relationship was probably doomed from the beginning. This is one of House of the Dragon's greatest strengths. It constantly reminds us that wars are not fought only with swords. They are also fought with memories, with childhood scars, with old jealousies, with things left unsaid. Sometimes entire kingdoms burn because families never learned how to love each other properly. Another major character worth discussing is Criston Cole, because beneath his reputation as a warrior, Criston is perhaps one of the saddest men in Westeros. This is someone who built his entire identity around honor, discipline, duty, and purpose. But deep down, Criston has been emotionally lost for a long time. Everything he believed in slowly collapsed. His ideals failed him. His loyalties brought disaster. And now he continues marching forward because he no longer knows how to stop. There is something almost frightening about that. People often assume dangerous individuals are driven by hatred, but sometimes they are driven by emptiness, by the inability to imagine another life. Criston seems exhausted, like a man who knows where his road ends but keeps walking anyway, because turning back would force him to confront everything he has become. And perhaps that is even more terrifying than death. This idea connects beautifully with one of the episode's biggest themes, the death of old dreams. Nearly every major character is mourning a future that no longer exists. Rhaenyra mourns the peaceful reign she once imagined. Alicent mourns the family she wanted to protect. Aegon mourns the life he lost. Baela mourns the future she was supposed to have. Even Daemon seems to mourn the heroic version of himself that only existed in songs. Everyone is grieving, not only people, but possibilities. And that type of grief is incredibly painful because it has no funeral, no burial, no final goodbye, only silence, only regret. Baela's storyline is particularly heartbreaking because she represents a younger generation already being consumed by this conflict. She was supposed to become queen, supposed to build a future with Jacaerys, supposed to inherit a world of hope. Instead, she inherited war, loss, uncertainty, and that reflects one of the central tragedies of the dance. Children always pay the highest price for the ambitions of adults. They inherit conflicts they never created. They suffer consequences they never deserved. And by the end of this war, an entire generation will carry scars that may never heal. The episode also continues exploring the idea of legitimacy. Who deserves power? Who has the better claim? Who should rule? Interestingly, House of the Dragon never gives easy answers, because legitimacy itself is often an illusion. Kings rule because people agree that they should rule. The moment enough people stop believing, everything changes. That's why symbols matter, crowns matter, prophecies matter, stories matter, because power is partly built on perception. A ruler can possess armies and dragons, but if people stop believing in them, their authority begins to crumble. And that is exactly what we are starting to witness. The realm is becoming fractured. Different groups support different visions of the future, and every new division makes peace more impossible. There is also a hidden emotional irony running through this episode. Everyone is fighting for family, yet family is exactly what they are destroying. Rhaenyra fights for her children. Alicent fights for her children. Aemond fights for his family. Aegon fights because of his family. Daemon fights for his bloodline. Yet every act of protection creates more suffering, more death, more separation. It almost feels like a curse, and perhaps that is the true meaning of the Dance of the Dragons. It is not merely a war for succession. It's a story about love becoming destructive, about how fear of losing family can sometimes destroy that very family. That idea feels painfully real, because history is full of people doing terrible things for reasons they believed were noble. And that moral complexity is exactly what makes this story so compelling. Then there is the question of destiny. Can these characters still change their future, or is everything already set in motion? Episode 5 repeatedly hints that events may now be moving beyond anyone's control. The armies are marching, the alliances are shifting, the hatred is deepening, and every new decision seems to close another door. This creates an atmosphere of inevitability, as if the tragedy has already begun,
and everyone is simply waiting for it to arrive. That feeling is terrifying, because viewers know what kind of story this is. This is not a tale where everyone rides into the sunset. This is the Dance of the Dragons, a story remembered not for its victories, but for its losses. And that knowledge hangs over every scene, every conversation, every emotional moment.
And this brings us to the biggest question of Episode 5. Has the Dance of the Dragons already passed the point of no return? Because by the end of this episode, almost every major player is acting from pain rather than reason, and history has shown us something terrifying. Wars usually become most dangerous when nobody remembers how they started. People stop fighting for justice. They stop fighting for peace. Eventually, they fight because they have already lost too much to stop. And that is exactly where Westeros seems to be heading. The original arguments no longer matter. The succession crisis no longer feels like the central issue. Now it's about revenge, pride, fear, and survival. The war has taken on a life of its own, and that is what makes this episode so unsettling, because everyone can sense it, even if they refuse to admit it. One of the most important themes here is legacy. Every single character wants to be remembered. Rhaenyra wants to be remembered as the rightful queen. Aegon wants to prove he is more than a failed king. Aemond wants history to fear his name. Daemon wants to become the legendary dragon prince he always imagined. But House of the Dragons constantly asks a difficult question. What if history remembers you differently? What if your greatest victory becomes your greatest mistake? Because history is cruel. It rarely remembers intentions. It remembers consequences. And the consequences of this war are becoming impossible to ignore. Cities are unstable. The realm is divided. The dragons themselves are slowly disappearing. Every victory feels smaller than the cost required to achieve it. That is the true tragedy of the dance. Nobody wins. Everyone loses something. Let's talk about Rhaenyra, because Episode 5 quietly shows how isolated she has become. At the beginning of her journey, she was surrounded by loved ones. Her father believed in her. Her children stood beside her. She still had hope, but now her world feels smaller, lonelier. She sits on the throne she fought so hard to claim, yet she seems unable to enjoy it, because power often creates distance. The higher someone rises, the fewer people they can truly trust, and Rhaenyra is beginning to experience that reality. Every advisor has their own agenda. Every lord expects something in return. Every decision creates new enemies. This is exactly why ruling is so difficult, because kings and queens rarely suffer from lack of power. They suffer from loneliness, and for perhaps the first time, Rhaenyra truly feels alone. That emotional isolation may become one of her greatest weaknesses, because grief and loneliness often lead people toward desperate decisions. At the same time, Daemon appears to be changing. For years, Daemon represented fire, action, chaos, but now he seems strangely reflective, almost disappointed, as if the reality of war has failed to live up to the fantasy. This is fascinating, because Daemon spent most of his life believing greatness could be achieved through force. Yet Episode 5 suggests something else. Force may win battles, but it cannot heal kingdoms, it cannot restore families, and it cannot erase regret. Deep down, Daemon may finally be realizing that the legends he admired were never as glorious as he imagined. The songs only tell us about victories. They rarely tell us about the suffering left behind. And this war is leaving suffering everywhere. Then there is Aemond, perhaps the most dangerous man in Westeros, but also one of the most tragic, because despite all his power, he remains that lonely little boy who wanted acceptance. That emotional wound still controls him, and wounds like that never truly disappear. They simply become buried beneath ambition, beneath anger, beneath pride. The problem is that wounded people often seek meaning through control. They believe power will finally make them feel secure. But power cannot change the past. It cannot undo childhood pain. It cannot force people to love you. And because of that, Aemond remains deeply vulnerable. That vulnerability makes him unpredictable, and unpredictability is terrifying when someone commands the largest dragon in the world. Another hidden detail throughout this episode is the repeated idea of imprisonment. Characters are constantly trapped, some physically, others emotionally. Alicent is trapped by guilt. Aegon is trapped by revenge. Rhaenyra is trapped by duty. Aemond is trapped by prophecy. Daemon is trapped by his own legend. Even the realm itself feels trapped, as if everyone is moving through corridors that are slowly closing around them. This symbolism appears again and again, and it reinforces one of the show's central messages. Power often becomes a prison. People chase it, believing it will make them free. Instead, it chains them. It demands sacrifices. It isolates them, and eventually, it consumes them, just as it consumed Viserys, and now it is beginning to consume his children. The ending of Episode 5 may not feature a massive dragon battle, but emotionally, it is one of the most important endings of the season because it reveals something terrifying. The kingdom is beginning to collapse from within. The enemy is no longer simply marching toward King's Landing. The enemy already exists inside the realm, inside cities, inside noble houses, inside the minds of the people. Fear is spreading. Rumors are spreading. Loyalty is becoming fragile, and history tells us that kingdoms rarely survive once trust begins to disappear. This ending feels very much like a setup episode. Pieces are moving into position, armies are marching, emotions are reaching breaking points, and major confrontations seem inevitable. The political situation is becoming increasingly unstable. The divisions inside the realm are deepening, and perhaps most importantly, characters are beginning to act out of desperation. Desperate people are dangerous, especially in a world filled with dragons. The next episodes may finally deliver some of the largest consequences of the war so far, because every storyline now feels ready to explode. What makes House of the Dragons so compelling isn't simply the dragons. It's the tragedy, the feeling that almost everyone here could have lived different lives. Rhaenyra could have been a peaceful queen. Alicent could have remained her friend. Aegon could have avoided the throne entirely. Aemond could have grown into someone very different. Daemon could have become a hero. But history rarely gives people ideal circumstances. Instead, it gives them impossible choices, and those choices slowly shape who they become. Episode 5 reminds us that the Dance of the Dragons is not merely a war for power. It is a story about family, about grief, about ambition, and about the terrible cost of refusing to let go, because every character believes they are protecting something, a crown, a child, a legacy, a dream. Yet in doing so, they may end up destroying the very things they love. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth in all of House of the Dragons. The dragons are not the real monsters. The real danger has always been human pride. And now that pride is pushing Westeros towards one of the darkest chapters in its history. The storm is coming. The pieces are in place. And when the fire finally reaches its peak, the realm may never recover from it.